Okay, guys, so let's pick up where we left last time with talking about the symptoms of schizophrenia. So we talked about the basic difference between positive and negative, which you definitely need to know for the test. And then we got into talking about delusions in particular. So that's where we wrapped up. That was the first example of a positive symptom in schizophrenia. And probably one of the most well-known symptoms, right, that most people know about. The other very well-known one, of course, is hallucinations. So hallucinations are essentially a sensory experience in the absence of any external perceptual stimuli. So your body is having a sensory experience without you actually perceiving something in that sensory domain. So by and large, auditory hallucinations are the most common, right? So this is what most people generally think of when they think of schizophrenia, right? Someone who hears voices. This is an auditory hallucination. So the person is hearing voices, but there's nobody actually speaking to them. So most patients with schizophrenia will report hearing more than one voice. It's typically very distracting, very hard to focus, very hard to concentrate. A lot of patients will say it's worse when they're alone. These voices will be, louder, and sometimes they'll fight with each other, if there's more than one voice. And critically, right, these voices typically aren't nice and friendly, right? So patients usually describe them as being critical, bossy, sometimes even abusive, telling them to do things, sometimes really terrible things. And, you definitely see some news stories about those types of things. And some people do actually act on their hallucinations in criminal ways if they may be responding to voices telling them to do criminal acts, essentially. But that is the minority, right? As we've talked about at the beginning of the class, when we talked about stigma, the vast majority of mentally ill patients are perfectly safe and are actually much more likely to be victimized themselves than to victimize other people. So keep that in mind, that is the exception rather than the rule, right? That someone with schizophrenia is violent because of their hallucinations. So again, auditory, by and large, the most common type of hallucination. The second most common is visual. So some people will report seeing things, right? Seeing members of the CIA who are out to get them, etc. So in that case, the hallucination actually merges with the delusion, right? The delusion, they have a delusion of persecution, that someone is out to get them, an agency or a specific group of people, and then they may have visual hallucinations that coincide with that delusion potentially. And then even more rare, some people will have tactile, so they'll feel things on their skin, gustatory, they'll taste things, and olfactory, they'll smell things. And again, in the absence of any of those perceptual experiences. Now, what's really interesting, right, is trying to figure out, well, where are these voices coming from, right? So it's not actually a voice they're hearing outside of their head. So how does this experience get generated for someone with schizophrenia? And so there's been some really interesting imaging work with PET and fMRI showing that patients may actually be misinterpreting their own self-generated thoughts as coming from an outside source. So what we think might be happening is that these are their own thoughts that they're having about themselves, but they think it's an outside voice telling it to them. And the key piece of evidence that you should know for the test that has sort of pointed researchers in this direction is that if you put these individuals in the scanner and you scan them when they're hallucinating, the part of the brain that's associated with speech production is activated in the brain. So they're telling you, I'm having a hallucination, I'm hearing a voice, but you're looking at their brain in real time, and it's the part of the brain that lights up with speech production that's activated, which indicates that they're actually producing, right, that voice. The part of the brain that is not activated is the part of the brain that's associated with speech comprehension, which is what you would expect to be lit up if they were actually hearing an outside voice. It should be speech comprehension that's activated. So again, it looks like they're actually producing these voices themselves and misinterpreting, not these voices, sorry, these thoughts, internal thoughts, and they're misinterpreting where they're coming from. So really neat way that neuroimaging and neuroscience, I think, it's a good example of how neuroscience can inform what's going on with these patients. Okay, last set of positive symptoms that we're going to talk about is disorganized speech. So we're going to watch some videos of patients in a little bit where you'll see some examples of this. But essentially, they're speaking to you, but they're not making a lot of sense. And it's interesting because their speech is conforming to semantic and syntactic rules that you would expect, but it still doesn't make sense. So the content sort of makes sense, but the form, the way these words are put together, is disorganized. And so there's three key examples of this that we see in schizophrenia. The first one is called loose associations. So a great example of this would be the problem is insects. My brother used to collect insects. He's now a man, 5'10". 10 is my favorite number. I also like to dance, draw, and watch television. So you can see here how this patient's having a really difficult time keeping one train of thought, right? They're kind of jumping. One sentence gets them off on another thought, that sentence gets them off on another thought, and they're just sort of loosely associating, right? One sentence from the next. So this is kind of interesting. This actually looks a little bit similar to what we saw in mania and hypomania and bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder a few chapters ago, where we talked about people have flight of ideas, right? So that was the term, the diagnostic term in the DSM and bipolar. Loose associations is sort of a similar idea, right? They're not keeping one train of thought, they're jumping from one thing to the next. Another form of disorganized speech we see in schizophrenia is neologisms. So this is essentially where they make up a word. And if you didn't know that they made it up, they are able to use it in a sentence oftentimes where it seems like it should make sense. Like, oh, maybe that's just a word I don't know or I haven't heard before, but it's actually one that they have made up. So an example is you have to have a plausity of all acts of amendment to go through for the children's code. Right, so syntactically and semantically, that sentence makes sense. And plausity seems like that could be a word that has a meaning that you just haven't been familiar with, but it's actually a completely made up word. And then the last example is clang. And this is just sort of rhyming words. And you'll see this sometimes actually in autism, which is a disorder we're not going to get to this semester. But they'll get sort of caught in rhyming a word, and the sentence will lose its meaning. Well, hell, it's well to tell is an example of that. Okay, so those are the main positive symptoms that you should know. Again, delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. The negative symptoms, remember, are when the person is lacking something in thought, emotion, or behavior that is typically present in most individuals. And so there's 4 key examples of this. So you see oftentimes what's called poverty of speech. Another word for that is alogia. And that is just an overall reduction in speech. So they're not speaking, the quantity of speech that they produce is lower, significantly lower than most people, right? They're just not talking very much. So, right, this is a deficit in behavior. The second one is blunted or flat affect. So oftentimes these individuals will show either less emotion than most people, or sometimes almost no emotion at all. They'll just be completely blank and flat in their affect. So again, an emotional repertoire that's typically seen in most individuals is missing. There's a deficit there. You will often see sometimes loss of volition, which is also known as avolition. So these people will seem like they're just really apathetic. They're just completely unable to start or complete things. So oftentimes family members will misinterpret this as, they're just lazy. They just need to get off their butt and do it. But it's actually a key symptom that it's just really difficult for them to get started on and complete things. And then the last one is anhedonia, which is diminished ability to experience pleasure. And so you should all remember this as a key symptom in unipolar depression, right? So things that they used to find enjoyable, just not enjoyable for them anymore. So those are positive and our negative symptoms. There's also this third category actually of disorganized behavior that you also see in these individuals. So you'll see impairment of goal-directed activity that occurs in most areas of daily functioning. So these patients typically have a really difficult time with work, holding down a job. Their social relationships are difficult. They struggle with self-care, so basic hygiene, safety, remembering to turn off the stove, for example, in their apartment, dressing appropriately for the weather, just some kind of basic self-care things. And then an extreme form of disorganized behavior that you may have seen before is something called catatonia, where it involves almost no movement at all. So if a patient is catatonic, for example, they might be in a bizarre or an unusual position like you see here, or they might be in a more normal position, but they're just really not moving much at all. And that would be a catatonic state. Okay, so just like last time I did a recorded lecture, obviously I can't get you guys to give me answers to these clicker questions, but I'm still going to include them to kind of give you a chance to test your knowledge as we go through. And then they'll also be here, obviously, as review questions for when you prepare for the final test. So this goes back to, we touched on this in class on Monday. Psychosis can be defined as what? Experiencing hallucinations, experiencing delusions, a loss of contact with reality, or an increase in impulsive behavior. So give that one a minute. Okay, and so hopefully most of you guys remember from class that this is the definition of psychosis is a loss of contact with reality. Okay, blank is an example of a positive symptom of schizophrenia, while blank is an example of a negative symptom. So is creativity a positive symptom and delusion a negative symptom? Is a hallucination a positive symptom while a delusion is a negative symptom? Is a delusion positive symptom while a hallucination is a negative symptom, so the opposite, B and C? Or finally, is a delusion a positive symptom while anhedonia is a negative symptom? So I'll give you just a minute to think about that. Okay, and hopefully you remember delusion positive, right? And the bizarre addition of behavior, anhedonia, something that's lacking. They're lacking pleasure in typically pleasurable activities. Okay, finally, Erin has a strong belief that the government is spying on her through her smoke detector. She has no evidence for this belief, and she holds on to this belief even though her family has taken the detector apart and shown her that there are no cameras or microphones inside. Erin is most likely suffering from what? A delusion, sorry, a hallucination, a delusion, an illusion, or a deception. Okay, and hopefully you guys remember, right, basic definition of a delusion, this strongly held belief that the person has a really difficult time changing or modifying even in the face of contradictory evidence. Oh, I thought that was the last one, but one more. Michael is hearing a voice in his head that he believes is coming from another person. Michael is most likely experiencing what? A hallucination, a delusion, psychotic speech, or disorganized speech. Okay, and hopefully most of you guys remember, right, that a hallucination is this sensory experience in the absence of any perceptual stimuli. So in this case, an auditory hallucination. Okay, so I'm going to watch a couple of videos of some different patients. So in this first one, actually, it's a psychiatrist who's talking a little bit about the different symptoms of schizophrenia. So he's going to talk about some different types of delusions and hallucinations primarily. And as he's talking, they're going to kind of cut to examples of patients actually demonstrating that type of delusion or that type of hallucination. So these are patients when they're, in the middle of a psychotic episode. They're not, currently medicated. So you actually see what the symptom looks like. So pay attention to both the symptom that they're displaying, the delusion or the hallucination, and also pay attention if you see evidence of any of the other types of symptoms. So the disorganized speech or any of the negative symptoms or the disorganized behavior, which again can all happen in addition to hallucinations and delusions. Okay.
It's characterized by symptoms primarily of auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. Voices often comment upon the person's behavior, or they may tell the person to do things. The second most common, patients will have visual hallucinations, and less commonly will have tactile and rarely olfactory or gustatory hallucinations. They also have what are called some of the first-rank symptoms of Schneider, including ideas of control, a sense that one's actions, thoughts, or emotions are being controlled by an external influence.
The demons in me control my eyes. Every part of me is demonic, where I can be beheaded and will my head will rejoin or pop up a new one. And that is what happened to me when I got tripped by grounded by my orbiter in a place called Jedi Garden.
Nowadays, a radio chip or X-rays. In the old days, voodoo was a common cause for that. Symptoms of thought insertion and thought withdrawal, where strange thoughts either appear in the person's mind or thoughts are taken out of your mind.
I can be thinking something and the thought will be taken away, and then I have to just think and think and think and think until the thought comes back again.
Mm-hmm. And finally, delusions, fixed false beliefs not understandable within the context of the person's background. Common delusions include paranoid delusions, the belief that the CIA or the FBI is following you, has tapped your phone, or that some group is conspiring to poison you or to interfere with your life in some malignant way.
Well, again, the big one was about the CIA, that the CIA was trying me to spy, but I also believe that they were grooming me to be in a James Bond movie.
And the voice would tell you this?
Yeah.
All this occurs in the setting of clear consciousness, no disorientation, and no obvious signs of delirium.
Okay, great. So we saw 3 different vignettes there, or clips of patients. So a couple things I want to draw your attention to. The first patient, the African-American male, was demonstrating delusions of control, right? A delusion of control where he felt that he was possessed and controlled by demons, essentially. The other thing I thought he may have demonstrated, it was a little bit hard to hear him, was possibly a neologism or 2. He seemed like he might have made up some words at the very end. He said it was grounded by his something in a place called Jedi something. Didn't really sound like words that I knew, although it was hard to make out. So those might have been some examples of neologism if we think about disorganized speech as well. The second lady, the African-American lady, was talking about thought withdrawal, which is another example of a delusion of control. And the thing that I thought she may have been demonstrating as well, potentially, was maybe some lack of affect, right? She was pretty flat. She wasn't really showing much emotion, much, modulation in her speech as she was talking. And then finally, the last individual, the Caucasian male, was again demonstrating a delusion of persecution, right, or paranoid delusions. And he also had voices that were telling him that kind of fit with the delusion. So again, that was an example where the delusions and hallucinations are kind of acting together to convince the patient of something that's, again, quite scary and terrifying for most. Okay, the last, I'm going to do 3 more clips. They're all about Etta, one particular patient, where she's going to talk about her experiences with schizophrenia. So again, pay attention to what symptoms you see her display, both positive, negative, disorganized behavior, anything that you can kind of take note of in her case.
Say something more about the relationship between GM and the eagle.
Well, when you do the 25 of the clock, it means that you leave the house 25 after 1 to mail letters so that they can check on you, how you're mailing the mail, and they know where you're at that time.
And who's they?
That's the eagle.
Okay. And is the eagle something that is looking out after you, or is there a chance that the eagle could hurt you?
Well, they're the before on the clock. That's the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, and 3. They go by those numbers of the clock.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do the 25 after, that's the after side of the clock. We go by the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5
mm-hmm.
of the clock.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5, you go right, left to 7 number on the clock is the fire number. You go right, left to that number.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to go through all 3 videos of her before we talk a little bit about her symptoms.
Etta, are any of your thoughts or actions controlled by Jesus or General Motors or any of these forces?
I was getting messages around the clock.
From
from Jesus, even 12 o'clock at night. If I heard something in the alley, if I heard dogs barking, I would get up and I would look at the clock and I would write that down, what time I heard the dog, just to let Jesus know that I'm answering him.
Now, have you ever had the experience where you heard, besides these noises around the house, have you ever had the experience where you heard the radio or the television talking and you realized that there was a message on there meant for you? Kind of another signal for you.
Yes.
Okay, and one more video of Etta.
Have you been able to enjoy yourself at all, have fun since 1990?
Well, I think I spent all my time writing messages what Jesus gave me, so he would keep giving me messages.
Well, what happened to things that you used to do for fun?
Well, you really don't have no fun when you got a shotgun behind your head.
Yeah, okay. And I want to thank you very much.
I hope I did all right.
Okay. So some of the things that stand out with Etta's presentation, to me at least, and obviously if we were in class, I would get your opinions too. Right, the biggest thing is these delusions of reference that she has. So that's one of the 4 types of delusions that we talked about in last class, right? She thinks that there are these special things that have special meaning for her, right? The clock has special meaning. Certain numbers of the clock mean something to her in particular. The sound of dogs barking, those are messages for her from Jesus, those types of things. So delusions of reference. And these aren't obviously experienced as pleasant for her, even though she's smiling in this particular clip, but she actually describes it as having a gun behind her head, that she's unable to have fun or do things that she used to enjoy. So that would get at the anhedonia, right, as a negative symptom. She's so busy having to take notes and mail letters and respond to these messages that she's getting that she doesn't have time to do anything else that's fun or enjoyable for her. And then the last part I saw, a little bit of it seemed like some disorganized speech. It didn't clearly fall into neologisms or clang or loose associations, but when she was talking about the clock, the different numbers and the forward, backward, the words she was saying made sense, but they weren't really fitting together coherently. It was hard to understand what exactly she was saying about the numbers on the clock. So that could have been an example of some disorganized speech. Okay, so hopefully those videos give you a little bit of a taste of what patients might look like with this particular disorder. So those are the various symptoms of schizophrenia. How do we put them together then in terms of DSM-5 criteria for the disorder? So in order to meet diagnostic criteria, the person has to have 2 or more of the following, each present for a significant portion of time during a 1-month period. So it has to be, the majority of that 1-month period. You see at least 2 of delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. So those are all your positive symptoms, right? The negative symptoms all get lumped together. So even if they're displaying 3 negative symptoms, that's only going to count as 1 diagnostic criteria here in DSM. And then disorganized behavior is the last one. So they have to have at least 2 of these, right? So they could have schizophrenia without actually having delusions or hallucinations, which I think most people think of as sort of the hallmark symptoms of the disorder. So they could have disorganized speech and negative symptoms and still be diagnosed, for example. The impairment is a really important criterion here. So the level of functioning in work, relationships, or self-care is markedly below the level that was achieved prior to the onset of these symptoms. So this gets at, again, what we talked about last time, that initial definition of this disorder by Kraepelin, which was dementia praecox, right? Early onset dementia. You see this deterioration in cognitive functioning. And here, this is specifically getting at a deterioration in their level of functioning. So they were doing pretty well before, and then they deteriorate with the onset of the disorder. Even though these 2 symptoms have to be present for a significant portion of a 1-month period, there actually has to be continuous signs, some evidence of, at least one of these symptoms for at least 6 months. So it does have to have, be present for longer to make the diagnosis. And of course, it can't be due to any other disorder, substance, or medical condition. So obviously, some substances can induce psychotic episodes or psychotic experiences. So you definitely want to make sure that you're ruling out, that they haven't taken a hallucinogen or, a great amount of a methamphetamine, for example, before they're coming in for their evaluation. Okay, so which of the following is true regarding diagnosing someone with schizophrenia? Is it true that the individual must experience delusions and hallucinations in order to get the disorder? Is it the case that the presence of catatonic behavior and negative symptoms is sufficient for a diagnosis? So they just have those two symptoms and there's no other diagnostic criteria. They just need those two. Can a diagnosis be made only if the person is experiencing, a diagnosis can be made if the only symptom the individual is experiencing is hallucinations, as long as they're both visual and auditory. So would that work? Or are none of the above statements true about diagnosing someone with schizophrenia? Okay, and so the answer here is D. So the most prominent distractor here is B. So catatonic behavior and negative symptoms would be sufficient for criterion A, but they would also need to meet these three other diagnostic criteria too, which is what makes B incorrect in this case. Okay. So schizophrenia is the major disorder that we talk about in terms of psychotic disorders, but there are a couple of others that you should know about, and we're not going to go into all the details. I'm just going to tell you basically how they roughly differ from schizophrenia. The first is schizoaffective disorder, and so in this disorder, the patient is exhibiting features of both schizophrenia and a severe mood disorder. So that mood disorder could be either unipolar or bipolar 1 disorder. It's severe, right? And so one thing that's interesting about this schizoaffective disorder, when we covered mood disorders, we actually talked about how sometimes people with bipolar or major depressive disorder, they can sometimes show psychotic symptoms when they're manic or when they're depressed. So then what's the difference? What's the difference between someone who has a mood disorder with psychotic features versus someone who has schizoaffective disorder? So the key difference there. Yeah, just 1 second. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I had someone knock on my office door and I had to figure out how to pause the recording. So we were talking about, what makes schizoaffective disorder different from someone who has a mood disorder with psychotic features? So the key difference is if it's a mood disorder like bipolar 1 or major depressive disorder, they only have the psychotic symptoms when they're in a mood episode. It's different in schizoaffective disorder. So in schizoaffective disorder, the delusions or hallucinations have to be present at some point when they're not in a mood episode. So in schizoaffective disorder, you may see someone who's depressed or manic and has psychotic features, but there also has to be evidence that there's some point in time where they have these psychotic features, delusions or hallucinations, without being in a mood episode. So they kind of, those two pieces dissociate in schizoaffective disorder. There's some times where they don't occur together. That's the major difference. Schizophreniform disorder, this is a schizophrenia-like psychosis that lasts at least 1 month, but less than 6 months. So if you have a patient come in, they've had their symptoms for 3 or 4 months, you think they're probably eventually going to develop schizophrenia, but they just haven't met the time criterion yet. You would diagnose them with schizophreniform disorder, and then if the symptoms continued, you may eventually want to change that diagnosis to schizophrenia. Delusional disorder, these are where individuals have delusional beliefs, but otherwise their behavior is normal. So really, the only thing they're showing are those delusions, those strongly held beliefs, contrary to evidence. And then finally, brief psychotic disorder is where there's a sudden onset of psychotic symptoms, disorganized speech, or catatonic behavior, but it only lasts a few days. So as the title indicates, very brief. And then the person seems to bounce back after that. Okay. So let's see, I think that is, yes. So that's the gist of the symptoms, sort of the clinical presentation, the demographics, what it looks like. But let's start to get into risk factors. So the bulk of what we're going to talk about here with schizophrenia are genetic and biological factors, because these really are extremely prominent in this disorder. It's a bit similar, I would say, to bipolar in that regard. But when we talked about bipolar, there are a lot of biological factors that were implicated. OCD seems to be, an anxiety disorder that's more heavily biologically driven. Schizophrenia would be in that similar range. So here we just see essentially that having a relative with the disorder significantly raises a person's risk of developing schizophrenia. And the more closely related you are to the person with schizophrenia, the higher your risk is. So you see here identical twins, right? They share 100% of their genes. And your risk of developing schizophrenia if your identical twin has the disorder is almost 50%. In blue, right, you see family members with whom you share 50% of your genes. So your risk there is significantly less. And then it just keeps going down, right? Your second degree relatives, you share 25% of your genes. The risk there is a little bit smaller on average. Your first cousins, you share 12.5% of your genes. Your risk there is a little less. But in all of these family groups, you're higher than risk in the general population, which is about 1%. So again, the more strongly related you are to the person with the disorder, the higher your risk is. So we know a little bit more about the influence of genetics through these different types of studies that we can do. So we can study, right, the difference between identical and fraternal twins, again, knowing that identical twins share 100% of their genes, where fraternal twins share only 50%. And what you see here is the concordance rate among monozygotic twins, 48% of dyads where one identical twin has it, the other one will also have it. That's only the case in 17% of dizygotic twins who share 50% of their genes, so indicates again that genes play a key role here. However, you might also want to try to take account of the environmental factor, right? Because twins not only share genes, but they share an environment. They're raised in the same family typically. However, adoption studies allow us to try to tease apart the influence of genes versus environments. So when they look at people with schizophrenia who were adopted. So they'll look at, a whole sample of individuals who were adopted out from their biological parents and went on to develop schizophrenia. If they then go back and trace the biological relatives of these adopted kids who developed schizophrenia, the rate in their biological relatives is 13.3%. And then they'll look at the rate of schizophrenia in their adoptive relatives, right? The family who adopted them. The rate there is only 1.3%, right? So this again shows you that the influence of genes is much higher than the influence of environment, right? It doesn't seem like the shared environment they share with their adoptive relatives is very important since the concordance rate of schizophrenia is so low in that case. And then finally, there is evidence of a gene-environment interaction being likely. So there's this interesting study where they looked at the adopted children of mothers with schizophrenia. So they followed this sample of moms who had schizophrenia who had children and put those children up for adoption. So they know that there's a biological risk for these kids because all of their moms have schizophrenia, but they also assessed the quality of the adoptive family environment that they were raised in. And only those who had both high genetic risk, so a mom with schizophrenia, and who were adopted into a dysfunctional family environment went on to develop schizophrenia. So if there was someone who had high genetic risk but was adopted into a good family environment, their rates of schizophrenia were actually the same as those individuals who had low genetic risk. It really was this combination of the two, which hopefully you guys know by now. I've drilled into your head. This is an example of a diathesis stress model, right? So they need the genetic predisposition in addition to this dysfunctional family environment in order to go on to develop the disorder. So there have been some folks working in molecular genetics when it comes to schizophrenia as well. And here, molecular geneticists look for candidate genes that are involved in processes believed to be aberrant in schizophrenia, right? So if you know, obviously, that perceptual or sensory experiences are off, and maybe you want to look particularly at the genes that are involved in those processes and see if those give some clues about schizophrenia. And so one way that geneticists go about this work is by doing genome-wide association studies, where they essentially investigate the entire genome of individuals with schizophrenia. And a number of candidate genes have been implicated from this type of work. So a more recent study identified actually 108 different locations in the genome that are associated with the presence of schizophrenia, actually 83, the vast majority of which are completely newly discovered genetic regions, which is really interesting. And many of the candidate genes implicated are involved in dopamine. And we're going to talk about the important role that dopamine plays in this disorder. You also see some that are important in terms of glutamate functioning. And you see actually this really interesting overlap with genes that are involved in immune functioning. And actually people with schizophrenia are at 53% increased risk of developing an autoimmune disorder. And so this finding was actually the strongest finding in this study, this overlap between genes that are important in immune functioning and genes that seem to be related to schizophrenia. So that's kind of interesting. And then finally, what they also found was a really interesting genetic overlap with bipolar disorder. So a lot of the same genes that are implicated in bipolar disorder are also implicated in schizophrenia, which sort of makes sense if you think about the fact that folks with bipolar disorder can become psychotic when they're manic or when they're depressed. So seems to be some overlap in those disorders genetically. The sort of take-home message here is that schizophrenia is likely related to many genes working together to confer susceptibility to the illness, right? It's not likely that there's going to be one gene that's the schizophrenia gene. There's going to be many that work together to put someone at risk. Okay. Continuing on with talking about genes, it's important to talk about endophenotypes when it comes to schizophrenia. So these are discrete, stable, and measurable traits, so things that you can see and measure in the individual that are thought to be under genetic control. So they're linked to the person's genotype, their genes. And we could look at endophenotypes in any disorder, and they're thought to represent or reflect a predisposition to the disorder. So if you have that endophenotype, you're at risk for that disorder. And there's a couple that we know of in schizophrenia that have been identified. So one is individuals who tend to experience a lot of perceptual aberrations. They just tend to have these strange perceptual experiences. So a questionnaire that might get at this, for example, one item might be, ordinary colors sometimes seem much too bright for me. Right, perceptually, they're just more sensitive than other people. That could be an example that might reflect this endophenotype. Also, people who are high in what we call magical ideation. So they tend to have sort of magical or even maybe highly superstitious type of thinking. So an example of an item on a questionnaire that might get us magical ideation would be, at times I felt that a professor's lecture was meant especially for me, right? So people who, again, are scoring high on these constructs may have an endophenotype and have this predisposition for schizophrenia. And then the third one is impaired working memory. So it seems that people are having a difficult time with their working memory functioning. That also could be a reflective predisposition to schizophrenia. Okay, so this slide is very important. This is a big piece of the research in schizophrenia, which is what babies are exposed to in utero. What are the prenatal exposures that we know are associated with schizophrenia? And this is a really unique set of risk factors because you really only see this in schizophrenia. So what we see is there's a risk factor with viral infection. So a mom who contracts the flu in her first trimester of pregnancy, this is associated with a 7-fold increase in schizophrenia in babies, which is quite large, right? And so the idea here is the antibodies that a mom develops to the flu virus may somehow disturb the brain development of that infant. And we know the first trimester is really critical for brain development. So again, this is specific, not just prenatally, but the timing is very precise. So if the mom gets the flu in the second or third trimester, you do not see this increase. It's really first trimester when key pieces of brain development are happening for the developing fetus. You also see this link with rhesus incompatibility. So this is something that you get tested for when you're pregnant. So rhesus incompatibility is if a woman has something called Rh negative blood, while her developing fetus has Rh positive blood. And Rh is just it's a factor. Rh stands for rhesus factor, which is a protein on red blood cells. So if you are incompatible with your infant, you're positive and the infant's negative, or vice versa, there's over a two times increase in risk for schizophrenia for that baby. And the idea here is that if you're incompatible, the mother's immune system might get confused and might essentially make antibodies that will act against the baby's red blood cells. So they almost treat sort of the baby's blood cells as a foreign kind of toxic entity in the body, and they start to produce antibodies. And again, similar to the antibodies to the flu, this might damage the developing brain of the infant. We also see this increased risk when there are early nutritional deficiencies in the mom and or maternal stress. So you see greatly increased rates of schizophrenia during times of famine. We can go back historically and look at the Great Irish Famine, famines in different parts of the world, and you pretty consistently see increased rates during those times. You also see a 67% increase in schizophrenia risk if the mother experiences the death of a close family member while she's pregnant, right? So that the stress of that also seems to have an impact on the developing baby. And then lastly, if there are pregnancy and birth complications that happen. So if during delivery there's some type of problem that affects the oxygen supply to the newborn or oxygen to the brain, that also is related to increased risk for schizophrenia. And so the overarching theme with all these different prenatal exposures is that the key thing is that it seems that if the baby experiences some damage to the brain at a critical point in development, and again, this is often first trimester, sometimes early second trimester, when key brain development is happening, that seems to really shoot up risk for schizophrenia for these infants. Okay. So if we were going to try to put together what we've talked about so far with genes and environment, it might look something like this. The current thinking really emphasizes the interplay between multiple genetic factors, right? There's lots of things genetically and biologically that are going on, but also we know that environmental factors, and that environment can include the prenatal environment, are very important. And so a good summary statement would be a genetic liability to schizophrenia may predispose an individual to suffer more damage from environmental insults than would be the case in the absence of the genetic predisposition. So, right, so the genetic liability actually makes you more susceptible to those types of environmental factors. If you don't have the genetic piece, but you do experience the same environmental factors, they don't have the same effect on you as if you have, compared to when someone has that genetic liability. Okay, so there's this really interesting phenomenon with schizophrenia that differentiates, again, this gets back to talking a little bit about genes, because we're going to talk about identical versus fraternal twins, but also the prenatal environment, which is really important. So the thing I want you to focus on in these two pictures here is whether these infants are monochorionic or dichorionic. Okay, so monochorionic twins share the same placenta and therefore the same blood supply. So actually ignore diamniotic and monoamniotic. That's not important, the sacs that they're in. What's important is the red below, the fetal blood supply that they're getting from the mother. So only two-thirds of identical twins are actually monochorionic. So you might think that all twins would have the same placenta. That's not the case, actually. A third of identical twins will actually be dichorionic. The mother will develop and grow two separate placentas. The important thing here is that if you share a placenta with your identical twin, you're more likely to share infections. An infection that the mom gets, it just has to cross the barrier of one placenta in order for both babies or fetuses to be infected. Because dichorionic twins have separate placentas and separate fetal circulations, it's actually possible for an infection that the mom has to breach one placenta but not the other, which would result in very different prenatal environments, right, for these two twins. So Identical twins who are monochorionic, so these identical twins who share their placenta up here, they are 60% concordant for schizophrenia. So think of this, they're sharing 100% of their genes, they're identical, but they also have the exact same fetal blood supply in utero. Identical twins who are dichorionic, who have two separate placentas, their rate is actually only 11% concordant for schizophrenia, which is low, right? That's on the rank of fraternal twins who only share 50% of their genes, right? So what's going on here? What does this tell us? The idea here is that the genetic influences, those genetic rates that we looked at, identical twins versus fraternal twins, might really be inflated. And it might not be genes that's really the key thing here, but prenatal environment is more important, because here you're seeing it's really whether or not they share the same placenta that seems to be driving the concordant rate, not necessarily whether they share 100% of their genes. As we see here, both of these twins share 100% of their genes, but you see a really big difference in concordant rate depending on their prenatal environment. So really fascinating stuff that, again, you really only see in this disorder. Okay. So let's take a neurodevelopmental perspective here. So let's think about this. If these developing babies, if their brain development is disrupted at birth or in utero, why do we not see the disorder until the person is about 20, right? So remember, the average age of onset is about 20 to 24, particularly in men, you see that younger onset. What's going on in the interim? Why don't we see signs of this much earlier if their brain has actually already been damaged or disrupted in some way? Well, the idea here is that the brain lesion or lesions, whatever sort of critical piece of brain development was disrupted, that it lies dormant until normal developmental changes occur later in adolescence and early adulthood. And the changes that happen, those normal developmental neural changes, expose the problems that are there, the problems that result from this early brain abnormality. So you don't see it until these developmental changes occur. That's sort of the idea. That then begs the question, well, if the seeds are sown so early in life, prenatally, before the baby's born, can we see any early indications of vulnerability? Are there any things that we could pick up on, even subtle differences that might be present really early on before the person develops the full-blown illness at 20, 21, 22? So to answer this question, there's a really genius study that you guys should know about for the test that looked at home movies of the childhoods of individuals who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And what they did was they compared those people with schizophrenia, so these childhood movies, you would see like a set of siblings, and someone who was blind, who had no idea which of the siblings went on to develop schizophrenia, they would rate these home movies on all different kinds of behaviors. And what they wanted to do essentially was compare those who went on to develop schizophrenia to their non-disordered siblings, their siblings who did not go on to develop schizophrenia. And again, this is important. The coders are blind. The coders who are watching these tapes have no idea which of these siblings go on. So there's no way they can be biased to know which one goes on to develop schizophrenia. And they just rate. And again, we want to see, is there anything about these individuals who go on to develop schizophrenia that looks different early on? And what they found actually were a lot of differences. So by the age of 2, what they see in the siblings that go on to develop schizophrenia, they see unusual hand movements. They see less positive facial emotion compared to their non-disordered siblings. They see more negative facial emotion. They see delayed speech and motor development. They see deviations in attention. They see lower social competence, right? Difficulty interacting with other toddlers. And they see movement abnormalities, things like facial tics and blinking. So all kinds of things. So these are, again, maybe early signs of this brain predisposition, this brain sort of abnormality that's taken place that doesn't become really full-blown into the disorder until much later. But again, you see these early subtle signs, which I think is really fascinating. Okay. Which is the most accurate statement? The inheritance of schizophrenia is based entirely on genetics. Genetics play a role in whether one develops schizophrenia, but other factors are important as well. The environment plays the only role in the development of schizophrenia, or among both identical and fraternal twins, it is equally likely that both twins will develop schizophrenia. Okay, take a moment to think about that. Okay, so hopefully, right, we know genetics play a role, but other factors, primarily environmental factors, are very important as well. So hopefully you guys got that takeaway. Okay, so that's a lot about development, early exposure, genetics. Now let's go on to more of the brain abnormalities that we might see in adults with the disorder. So first, we see evidence of a lot of different neurocognitive deficits in people with schizophrenia. So we see, for example, attentional and working memory deficits. So they will have things like delayed reaction time. If you give them a task where they have to be quick about something, they'll be slower than individuals without schizophrenia. They have a more difficult time paying attention during tasks, or doing tasks where they have to hold information in their working memory while they're doing things. They really struggle. And this neurocognitive deficit, as well as the other two actually, they're seen long before the illness occurs. So again, these are present before someone develops schizophrenia. But in addition to that, you see a sharp decline in these functions as the person transitions to the full-blown illness. So these deficits are sort of already there in a mild form, and then they really tank once the person develops the official disorder. The second thing you see is eye tracking dysfunctions. So this is specifically in something that's called smooth pursuit eye movement, which is the ability that most of us have to seamlessly track a moving object. So if you look at this graph down here, the very bottom shows a target. So you imagine somebody sitting in front of a computer screen and there's a ball that's moving in this smooth way across the screen. And their job is just to track this object with your eye. Someone without schizophrenia can do this very nicely. This is smooth pursuit eye movement. They're tracking very smoothly as that object moves. Someone with schizophrenia has a much more difficult time, right? See how jagged, right? They've got eye movements all over the place. It's more difficult for them to more smoothly follow that object's path. The last thing we see is problems with sensory gating. So essentially, normally our brain will dampen or gate its response to repeated sensory events. So this would be how most people respond, right? So let's say you're in the lab and you hear a loud tone multiple times. The first time you hear it, if this is your EEG, if we're recording your electrical potential at the scalp from an auditory part of the brain, a part that is associated with auditory comprehension, you see a pretty big response to that initial noise. The second time you hear that noise, and subsequently if it continues, you have sensory gating. You dampen that response. This is really good evolutionarily, right? We can't pay attention to all of the stimuli in our environment. We would be completely overwhelmed all the time. We have to know what to sort of tune out and what to pay attention to. And if there's a sound that's just repetitively happening that's the same, we don't really need to pay attention to it. It's not important. If it's not hurting us, then we can sort of tune it out. People with schizophrenia have a difficult time with this. They respond almost as strongly to the second occurrence of a perceptual stimulus as the first. So they have a harder time gating out or inhibiting their response to stimuli that may not be very important. Okay. People with schizophrenia usually display deficits in which of the following areas even before they're diagnosed with the disorder? Areas of neurocognition like memory and attention, eye tracking, sensory gating, or all of the above. Let me just take a minute there. Okay, and hopefully you got that is all of the above. Okay, so a couple more biological risk factors to get through. And again, there are a lot with schizophrenia, but on the study guide for the final test, I'll try to narrow this down a bit for you. So a couple additional things we see in these patients. We see impaired social cognition. So these folks fail to spot subtle social hints in social situations. So for example, if you were sitting with someone with schizophrenia and they ordered this delicious molten chocolate cake for dessert, and you decided not to order anything, and you're sitting across from the table from them, and you say, "Oh, that molten chocolate cake looks so delicious," right? they may not offer you a bite, right? They fail to spot those subtle social hints, right? You don't want to necessarily ask for a bite, but you kind of say things that you think are going to make it obvious that the person is going to know you would like a bite, right? Those types of comments tend to sort of just go right over their heads. They don't see those subtle social pieces. They also tend to have difficulty recognizing emotion, both in someone's facial expression, so they can look at different facial expressions and they have a hard time identifying what emotion that person is feeling, and also from speech. So oftentimes, right, we can express our emotions via speech as well, and these patients have a hard time recognizing that form of emotion as well. Structurally, if we scan these individuals in the scanner, we see an overall loss of brain volume. And a big part of this is enlarged brain ventricles in some patients. And so to show you what this looks like, brain ventricles are fluid-filled spaces that lie deep within the brain, and they're indicative of reduction in brain tissue, right? Because if there's a fluid-filled space, then there's no tissue there. And so this picture shows that the brain scans of identical twins. This one on the right is the only one that has schizophrenia. And you can see his or her enlarged brain ventricles that are not present in the non-affected identical twin. So this twin does not have schizophrenia. So again, overall reduction in brain volume because you have these larger fluid-filled spaces. You also see gray matter loss in these individuals. So gray matter is made up of nerve cells, and this just seems to decrease over time in these individuals. And we see particularly this gray matter loss in frontal and temporal lobes. And these are parts of the brain that are associated with memory, decision-making, and auditory processing, which might give us some clues about the high rates of auditory hallucinations, right, that we see in these patients. Finally, we also see reduced volume in the white matter parts of the brain. So the white matter, right, the gray matter is the nerve cell. The white matter is the nerve fibers that are covered in a myelin sheath. And the myelin is really important because it increases the speed and the efficiency of conduction between nerve cells. And in individuals with schizophrenia, you see reduced volume of that white matter. There's less myelin coating these nerve fibers. And the degree of white matter reduction in volume is actually related to cognitive impairment. So the greater the decrease in white matter, the greater the cognitive impairments that the patient seems to suffer. Okay. Schizophrenia is associated with which of the following? Reduced gray matter volume, reduced white matter volume, both A and B, or neither A nor B? I'll take a minute to think about that. Okay, and hopefully you remember that it's both parts of brain volume that are affected in schizophrenia. Okay, so that was structural brain abnormalities. We also see functional brain abnormalities in these individuals. So there's disrupted brain functioning at the level of, we see that these patients are much less efficient at challenging tasks. And this seems to be associated with frontal lobe impairment. So if you give them a challenging task, you'll see one of two presentations. So they're not very quick at doing the task, but also if you're looking at their brain functioning, if you're scanning them while they're completing the task, you'll either see less activity in frontal lobe, which sort of indicates that their brain is unable to kick into action when they're performing a complex task. Or in other patients, you actually see that their frontal lobes are super overactive. So they're not efficient at the task, but their brain is working really hard, which means that their brain has to work harder than most people. And either of those profiles, either underactivity or overactivity of frontal lobe during these challenging tasks, is related to negative symptoms in schizophrenia. So it's harder for their brain to do the work that other people, right, don't have to work as hard at. Where there's also some evidence of compromised cytoarchitecture. So cytoarchitecture simply just means the overall organization of cells in the brain. So we know that early in development, right, neurons, brain cells are migrating, right? They're moving all over the brain as your brain develops through infancy, but also in adolescence, there's still some movement and organization of cells that are happening. This seems to be compromised in schizophrenia, where the idea is basically the brain cells of these individuals fail to arrive at their final destinations, where they're supposed to sort of eventually end up in the brain, seems to be compromised in these individuals. There's also some evidence of disrupted brain development in adolescence. So we talked a lot about disruptions in brain development in utero, prenatally. But you also see some, right, if there's disrupted brain development in adolescence, there's also increased risk. And you see some of these impairments that are seen in schizophrenia. So for example, head injuries, particularly between the ages of 11 and 15, seems to increase the risk for schizophrenia. We also know that there's a lot of neuronal pruning happening, right? So around up until adolescence, you have way more neurons than you're going to eventually end up with in adulthood. And through this pruning process, the idea is if something goes awry with this pruning process, that may also increase your risk. So just like prenatally, this is another sensitive period of brain development. And if things go awry, your risk might be increased. And then finally, in terms of neurochemistry, excess dopamine has been a huge finding, right? So in general, patients with this disorder have much more dopamine circulating in their brain compared to individuals without the disorder. And they also seem to have low or deficient levels of glutamate. Those are the two neurotransmitters that are most important in this disorder. Okay. Which of the following terms is used to refer to the idea that disruptions in the migration of neurons can lead to compromised organization of cells in the brains of people with schizophrenia? This is the term compromised neurochemistry, compromised cytoarchitecture, white matter disorganization, or gray matter disorganization. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Okay, and hopefully you guys remember that is compromised cytoarchitecture. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. That was a lot about biology and genetics. And again, remember that those factors seem to be more prominent in schizophrenia. However, there are some psychosocial and cultural factors that are important as well. So early on, there were a lot of theories about bad families causing schizophrenia. And by and large, these have not stood the test of time. So the most prominent of these was the idea of the schizophrenogenic mother, the mother who was very cold and aloof and just didn't have the time of day for her child. It was thought that that was really the main risk factor for the disorder. And there's absolutely no evidence that that's the case. That's been completely debunked. There also has been some research that individuals with schizophrenia, their families tend to have a lot of communication problems, and people thought that that, again, might be a cause for the disorder. However, there's emerging evidence that communication problems may be simply the result of having a person with psychosis in the family. So it doesn't necessarily cause the psychosis, but a family having to deal with a patient with these extreme and severe symptoms leads to a breakdown in communication. So again, not necessarily a risk factor. However, one piece that we have seen a lot of evidence for is this construct known as expressed emotion, which you should know. So patients with schizophrenia are much more likely to relapse, have a relapse into psychosis, if their families are high in this construct of expressed emotion. And so how we assess this is we have a private interviewer, right? The researcher interviews family members of the patient with schizophrenia privately, not with the patient there. And they talk to them, right, about the patient and about how they get along, etc. And in those interviews, if you see high rates of criticism of the patient, high rates of hostility toward the patient, and high rates of what we call emotional over-involvement. So this is sort of basically a very dramatic and over-concerned attitude toward the patient. You're just way overly involved emotionally in the person's symptoms and their life, etc. If you see high levels of these three variables among family members of the patient, that family is said to be high in expressed emotion, and those patients do much more poorly going forward. They tend to relapse more often if they come from a family that has this type of emotional environment. What about psychosocial and cultural aspects? So a couple of things stand out here as well. Urban living, so we do see higher rates of the disorder when individuals are raised in urban environments versus rural environments. And this is thought to just simply reflect sort of a higher stress environment. We think about environmental factors that might trigger underlying genetic and biological vulnerabilities. You also see higher rates of schizophrenia in immigrants compared to individuals that are native to a particular country. And this is really thought to be related to the stress that's associated with the social adversity that comes with being an immigrant, and also the discrimination that immigrants face often when being in a new country. And there's a really interesting finding, I think, that highlights the discrimination piece, which is that even among immigrants, you see higher rates of schizophrenia in those with darker skin tones. And what researchers think is going on there is that the more dark one's skin is, potentially they may be exposed to more discrimination, more social adversity, more stress, and that's what's resulting in them having even higher rates of the disorder. The last sort of cultural piece is cannabis use and abuse. People with schizophrenia are twice as likely as the general population to smoke cannabis, so they're high rates. They're also really high nicotine users as well. And importantly, this seems to be a predictor of the onset of the disorder. So it's not necessarily that people are developing schizophrenia and then smoking cannabis as a way to cope with their symptoms. There seems to be some good research that they may actually be smoking the cannabis before the disorder onsets. However, it's likely that cannabis is only a predictor of schizophrenia for those who are already at genetic risk. So if you really have no underlying vulnerability or predisposition, you're probably not going to increase your risk for the disorder by smoking cannabis. However, if you do have that underlying vulnerability and you're a high cannabis user, that could be a predictor for the onset of the disorder for you. Okay, so if we kind of put together everything that we have talked about and think about a diathesis stress model of schizophrenia, what would this look like? So we've got the genetic factors that we know are important, right? The more strongly related you are to someone with schizophrenia, the higher your risk for the disorder is. But we also have what we know about the prenatal and perinatal events that are important, right? Prenatal exposure to viruses, perinatal lack of oxygen during delivery, for example. These two biological pieces lead to this underlying brain vulnerability that someone has very early in life, essentially when they're born. Something is disrupted in their brain, but it's not quite immediately apparent, right? They might show some of those softer signs, some of the movement differences, the deviations in attention, those sort of subtle signs we saw in kids up to the age of 2. But what really puts someone over the edge into psychosis is 2 different things. One is stressful environments, right? So that could come from family stress, living in an urban environment, being an immigrant, but also natural developmental maturation processes in the brain that often happen in adolescence and early adulthood. And as those 3 factors combine, stress, brain vulnerability, and development, you have the emergence of psychosis in a number of these patients. Okay. So we may not get to all of treatment, but let's get a little bit of a start on it before we wrap up. So in terms of treatment and outcomes for these individuals, now that we've talked pretty extensively about the risk factors, before the 1950s, the prognosis for schizophrenia was bleak. It was really, really bad. There were not any good treatments for these individuals. Many of them were sort of destined to be hospitalized long-term in an institution, a psychiatric hospital, and or homeless on the street. The introduction of antipsychotic drugs in the 1950s completely changed this. So these drugs dramatically improved the prognosis of individuals with this disorder. And currently, if you look 15 to 25 years after an initial diagnosis, about 40% of people with this disorder are functioning fairly well, which, given the severity of this disorder, is actually a pretty good, right, long-term outcome. However, still, in these days, with the antipsychotic drugs that we have, long-term institutionalization is still necessary for about 12% of individuals. About 1 in 10 are still going to need that long-term institutionalization because their symptoms are just so chronic and so impairing. I think I'm going to go ahead and maybe wrap up there. So we're going to get into talking about specific pharmacological approaches, in particular first generation versus second generation antipsychotics and how effective they are. And then we'll get into the last part of this lecture is different psychosocial approaches to the disorder. So we always think about medications in particular for this disorder, and that is the most prominent, that's the first line treatment. But actually in recent years, I think a lot of researchers and clinicians are realizing the extreme utility and how helpful it can be to augment medication with a number of psychosocial approaches, some of which we've talked about, like CBT, but some of which are a little different, like social skills training and case management, and definitely cognitive remediation. So I'll wrap up a few minutes early, and we'll get to the rest of these slides the Monday after Thanksgiving. We'll wrap this up, and then we'll get a start on our very last chapter, which is personality disorders. And remember that those quizzes for personality disorders are due in Rebel on Monday before the start of class. I hope you guys all have a wonderful and restful Thanksgiving, and I will see you guys on Monday. Thanks.